The tiny village of Silver Plume, Colorado, with a population of only 200, rests deep in the heart of the Rocky Mountains. On September 7, 1987, Tom Young closed up his bookshop on Main Street and, along with his dog, Gus, disappeared. 9 months later, a new resident of Silver Plume, Keith Reinhard, opened an antique shop at exactly the same location. On August 7, 1988, Keith closed up his shop for the day. Less than 2 hours later, Keith Reinhard also disappeared. There were just too many coincidences. Keith Reinhard and Tom Young both rented the same store. They both left town promising to return. That alone would be strange enough, but when you look closer, the coincidences start to feel almost impossible. One man walked into the mountains with his dog and a rifle and never returned alive. The other followed in his footsteps a year later, carrying with him an unfinished novel about a man who goes missing in the mountains. Two men, one small town, the same store, the same fate. Was it coincidence, destiny, or something far darker hiding in the mountains above Silver Plume? This story begins with a town, a very small town called Silver Plume in the mountains of Colorado. Silver Plume isn't a place most people have heard of. It sits high up in the Rockies, more than 9,000 feet above sea level. Once, in the late 1800s, it was alive with miners chasing silver. But by the 1980s, it was little more than a ghost town. Only about 200 people lived there. The main street had a few old wooden buildings left over from its boom days, a couple of shops, a cafe, a bookstore. But most of Silver Plume was quiet, too quiet, the kind of place where time doesn't move the same way, where the silence of the mountains feels heavy, almost unnatural. And in this little town, there was one building everyone knew about, a place the locals didn't like to talk about. Some even walked the long way around just to avoid it. That building was the old bookstore. It looked ordinary enough from the outside, just another wooden storefront left over from Silver Plume's mining days. But it carried a reputation. People said the building felt cold, even on warm days. That stepping inside gave you the sense of being watched. First owned by a man named Tom Young, and later by a man named Keith Reinhard. Two different men, two different stories, and yet both of them would be tied to that bookstore and to the mountains above it in ways that feel far too strange to ignore. In the summer of 1988, Keith Reinhard moved to Silver Plume from Chicago with three personal goals. First, to get in shape by climbing the mountains that surrounded the town. Second, to finally overcome his lifelong fear of heights. And third, to begin writing a novel, something he had dreamed of doing for years but never managed to start while working his regular job. Keith Reinhard wasn't just another drifter passing through Silver Plume. He was a 49-year-old sports writer from Chicago, married with a grown daughter, and known among friends as intelligent but also restless. He had worked for the same newspaper for more than 20 years, a steady job that gave him security, but not the fulfillment he was searching for. The chaos of city life had worn him down. Keith was tired of the noise, the traffic, and the constant deadlines in Chicago. He dreamed of staying in a small town in the mountains, where life moved slower and the silence might give him peace of mind. When he learned that a little antique shop in Silver Plume was available, he was thrilled. It felt like the perfect opportunity. He would finally have enough time to focus on writing his book, something he had put off for years. At the same time, he could earn a little money from the shop, and if things went well, maybe it could even be a reason strong enough to convince his family to join him in the mountains. Another motivation was the fact that his old friend Ted Parker ran a cafe just across the street. Knowing someone he trusted was nearby made the idea even more appealing. Keith Reinhard and I grew up across the street from one another, and we'd known each other about 40 years. I would say that our relationship was similar to that of brothers. Keith was apprehensive and excited about turning 50. He was here to finish out the last of his 40s in the way that he dreamed of. But he had no idea about the shop's past or the fate of its former owner. By stepping inside, he was walking straight into a story already marked by mystery and loss. So during the first few days after Keith's arrival in Silver Plume, it's a very small town, as you've probably seen on Google Maps. There isn't much going on there. Only a few hundred people live there. Rumors spread very quickly. One day while talking to the locals, Keith learned some very disturbing news. Just 9 months earlier, the very shop he had turned into an antique store had been a bookstore. Its owner, a quiet man named Tom Young, had vanished along with his dog, Gus. At the time, Tom had told people he was planning a vacation to Europe, so when he disappeared, no one thought much of it at first. But after 3 weeks without a word, locals began to grow suspicious. As soon as Keith heard the story, he couldn't let it go. What began as curiosity quickly grew into fascination, almost an obsession with the strange disappearance. He wanted to know every detail. He asked the townspeople endless questions, anyone who had ever spoken to Tom. What had really happened to him? Why had no one noticed his absence until weeks had passed? And why, of all the buildings in this quiet town, had that particular shop ended up in Keith's hands? Eventually, Keith decided to base his novel on Tom Young. When he began to write, he created a character named Guy Gypsum, a composite of himself and Tom. The more he learned, the more uneasy he became. Some locals brushed off the story as tragic but ordinary, saying Tom had probably taken his own life. Others lowered their voices, hinting at something darker, bad luck, secrets, even a curse tied to the building itself. Instead of keeping his distance, Keith leaned in closer. He spent hours replaying the story in his head, jotting down notes, and weaving Tom's disappearance into the novel he had started writing. It was as if he was no longer just researching another man's fate. He was stepping directly into it. According to his daughter, Tiffany, sometimes it seemed hard for Keith to tell the difference between fact and fiction. Writers like to live the story they're writing about, get a feel of it so it's easier for them to write about it. Maybe my father, it's always possible, wanted to feel what it's like to disappear so he could write about it. What Keith didn't realize, or maybe what he refused to admit, was that his book was beginning to predict his own future. Keith spent his first 2 months in Silver Plume working on his novel, completely absorbed in the story of Tom Young. Then on July 31st, 1988, a group of hunters were out on the slopes of Republican Mountain, just outside of Silver Plume. They were scouting the area for the upcoming hunting season when they came across a very disturbing scene. They discovered a human skeleton, and beside it, the remains of a dog. Both had bullet holes in their skulls. Lying nearby was a revolver. Investigators quickly connected it to Tom Young, who had purchased a gun only a few days before his disappearance. The site was only a few miles in a straight line from Silver Plume's Main Street. Soon the remains were confirmed as those of Tom Young. Considering the revolver at the scene and the fact that even the dog had been shot, it was ruled that Tom Young had taken his own life. This was a huge event in Silver Plume. Everyone in town paid attention, but no one more than Keith Reinhard. For weeks, he had been shaping his novel around a character based on Tom, living through him on paper. And suddenly, Tom's fate was no longer just a mystery. It was fact, right in front of him. The ending Keith had been writing now felt disturbingly real. A week had passed since Tom's body was found. One afternoon, Keith closed his little antique shop a few hours earlier than usual. He stepped out onto Main Street, moving from one familiar face to another, telling everyone the same thing. He was going to climb to the top of nearby Pendleton Mountain. One of his stops was Ted Parker's cafe. He was in the cafe and told me he was going to make it to the top of the mountain. If I don't come back, call on the rescue, and he said that in jest, I felt. I have this picture of him pointing to the mountain and saying goodbye. That was the last time I saw him. Keith was last seen walking toward Pendleton Mountain at 4:30 in the afternoon, far too late in the day to begin a difficult 6-hour hike. That night, Keith Reinhard did not return. The next day, helicopters were called to search the mountain. On the ground, more than 125 men and a dozen trained dogs combed the difficult terrain for 7 days. Despite the massive operation, the largest search effort Colorado had seen at the time, there was no trace, no clothing, no backpack, no footprints, nothing. It was as if the mountain had swallowed him whole. For the people of Silver Plume, it was an all too familiar story. First Tom, now Keith. Two men tied to the same shop, lost to the same wilderness. And just like that, another mystery was written into the silence of the mountains. Then searchers came across something that left everyone in shock. A discovery that only deepened the mystery instead of solving it. Searchers began going through his personal belongings and workspace, hoping to find some clue about what might have happened. When they entered his workspace, they found the exact spot where Keith had been developing his novel, shaping the character he called Guy Gypsum. And right beside his computer was a newspaper, left open on a headline. It lay directly next to the place where he had been writing. The headline read, "Body of Tom Young Found Naturally." When searchers and friends looked through Keith's computer, they found the unfinished novel he had been working on all summer. The story wasn't complete, but the last 3 sentences he had written sent chills through everyone who read them. They said, Guy Gypsum changed into some hiking boots and pulled on a heavy flannel shirt. He understood Tom now, and his motivation. Guy closed the door and walked off toward the lush, shadowless Colorado forest above. The timing was terrifying. In the middle of the search for Keith Reinhard, with helicopters in the air and rescuers on the ground, his last words described a character based on Tom Young, walking into the forest and never coming back. The search for Keith became the largest in Alpine Rescue Team's history. For 7 days, more than 100 men, trained dogs, and aircraft scoured the mountain. Tragically, one of the search planes crashed, killing the pilot. After that, the effort was called off. Keith Reinhard became the first person in 30 years that Alpine Rescue had failed to find. To this day, no trace of him has ever been discovered. Over the years, many theories have surfaced about what really happened to Keith Reinhard and to Tom Young before him. None have ever been proven, but each one tries to explain how 2 men tied to the same shop in Silver Plume could vanish under such strange circumstances. The first and most common theory is suicide. When Keith arrived in Silver Plume, he had big ambitions: to get into shape, to conquer his fear of heights, and to finally move his family to the mountains. But after 2 months, it was clear that his antique shop wasn't making money. The dream of relocating his family had collapsed. Already struggling with a midlife crisis, Keith may have felt crushed by failure. To some, it seems he followed the same path as Tom Young, staging a casual excuse about a hike, only to slip away and end his life elsewhere. Tom had told people he was going to Europe. Keith told people he was going to climb Pendleton Mountain. Neither man ever came back. However, his wife Carolyn Reinhard disagreed with that theory. "I don't think that Keith would be the type of person to walk away from his whole entire life and leave it behind him. He loved the people in his life. He loved keeping in touch with them, and I don't think he could have left them all behind him." Another theory points to foul play. Both Tom and Keith operated from the same storefront, and some believe there may have been something dangerous tied to that property: debts, secrets, or knowledge they weren't supposed to uncover. Supporters of this theory suggest Tom may have been murdered, his death staged to look like suicide. They point to 2 suspicious details. The revolver found with his body was too damaged after a Colorado winter to ever be tested, and those who knew Tom said it was unthinkable that he would shoot his beloved dog. Keith, digging deeper into Tom's disappearance for his novel, may have stumbled onto something. And according to this theory, he was silenced before he could expose it. The final and perhaps most plausible theory is that Keith simply made a fatal mistake in the backcountry. He set out at 4:30 in the afternoon, far too late to begin a difficult 6-hour hike. He had no food, no flashlight, and no proper gear. It's entirely possible he lost his way after dark, slipped into a ravine, or fell from a cliff. Despite the massive search, these are the Rocky Mountains, full of dense forests, deep crevices, and terrain that can easily conceal a body for decades. Even the best rescue teams sometimes miss what nature works hard to hide. To this day, no one knows what really happened to Keith Reinhard or Tom Young. Their disappearances remain an unsolved mystery in the quiet mountain town of Silver Plume,